Episode 283, Organic, Biodynamic or Permaculture. This is The Change Underground. I'm your host, John Moore. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Bit of a back to first principles episode this week. I think we can take it as read that if you're listening to this podcast, the chemical route to food production is a no-go. This can leave a bewildering mass of other choices though. From the generic organic to the semi-proprietary biodynamic and permaculture. And we can, of course, toss in regenerative agriculture as well. So as I say, let's go back to first principles. What are we attempting to do? Why are we doing it? Then finally, how? So what are we attempting to do? This is a relatively straightforward question, but it does need to be answered. For me, and maybe for you too, the answer goes something like this. I'm attempting to grow as much food as possible in the safest way possible. This includes, but is not limited to, vegetables, fruit, cereals, eggs and meat. Any surplus over time can be preserved and or sold, swapped, gifted, depending on how great the surplus is and the situation we find ourselves in. Why are we doing this? Well, this is as personal as it gets. I'm growing our own because I prefer to know where my food comes from. I like to have short supply chains. There's less time and distance for things to go wrong. If my food is never in a truck that's moved other food that's been oversprayed, it can't inadvertently become contaminated with poisons. There's way less probability of it being part of the food recalls that regularly plague the supermarket sector. And there's also a deeply satisfying effect that comes from growing your own. A connection to the vast majority of humans for whom growing food was the only reason for getting out of bed. From the Neolithic early first farmers to the Papuan gardeners of the deep past to the babushkas of modern Russia who produce 75% of the fruit consumed in that state each year. Growing my little gardens connects me with something much bigger. Doing it organically, restoratively, regeneratively and thoughtfully connects me to a higher purpose. To being part of a movement redirecting the biosphere back to a healthy, sustainable future. The many little steps make great change idea. On that matter, the use and reuse of heirloom heritage open pollinated seeds is another strand in this redirecting movement. Saving and creating localised varieties of vegetables for flavour, for stability in seed supply, for biodiversity and for personal satisfaction of doing so are principled things to do. Finally, how? This is where the be careful not to be overwhelmed caution kicks in. Back in the day, as I'm now qualified to say, having reached the big 6-0, the choices were very simple, chemical or organic. Organic covered such esoteric ideas as biodynamics and biointensive, but basically it was chemicals or not. Nowadays the choices can be overwhelming. Natural farming, permaculture, brown permaculture, purple permaculture, restorative, regenerative, victory gardens, vegetarian, vegan, dig, no dig, even minimal dig. Where the hell does one start? Okay, let's create a framework for decision making. We'll go with the idea that we're not going the chemical route, and I think that's reasonable. So organic. Do we dig or not? If not, why not? And there are two reasons, I think, to go this way. One, digging is hard work. And two, bare soil releases CO2. Digging, though, might be an option if you want to get plants growing quickly. If you're able to get plants growing quickly so you can overcome the loss of CO2, so that the net CO2 over the year has you in negative. That is, you've sucked more out of the air than you've put into it. Choosing to use machinery to prepare beds would be such a situation. It's the ploughing, disking, rotivating and fallowing of beds that leads to excessive CO2 leakage, and beyond that which can be reinstated in the soil. So minimal till and cover quick. Equally unhelpful, I would argue, would be double digging. Now this was recommended by John Seymour, my original mentor in writing. To be fair, nearly every other gardening textbook I read in the 1970s and 80s said to do the same thing. John Jeevons in the biointensive method still advocates this. I find it unnecessary and destructive of soil structure. Maybe if the soil is overly compacted, it might be an option, But there are other ways of overcoming this problem. Anything from daikon radishes to mulch plus compost worms would get the job done, and with far less damage to the soil structure. Layering is also a possibility. Looking to forests for inspiration, layering seems a no-brainer. Forests also happily support pigs, who do dig, so minimal till and layering of mulch would be the best replication of natural systems, I suspect. You make your decision and you live with your consequences. It's pretty much that simple. So let's assume we have our beds. They're all prepared, ready to go. The next question is, in inverted commas, growing system. Now, Biodynamic, at least the Demeter version, relies upon minimal till and biological sprays to rebuild and enhance whatever biology is extant. And it can be used to build biology over time. Permaculture relies upon interconnected plant and animal species in an engineered system to grow the biology over time. I mentioned earlier both purple and brown permaculture. Now, I heard these distinctions on a podcast that no longer exists and whose name I just cannot remember. The permaculture designer being interviewed was firmly in the brown camp. By this, he meant working with the soil, measuring soil health through testing, observing interactions between species and the system as a whole, whilst making a profit, a sufficient profit to justify the price of the land they were working on. He then described the purple wing of permaculture, which he bumped up against when he was doing his permaculture design certificate, as doing something similar but including meditation and sort of a kumbaya feel. I'm not denigrating either ideal, but point out these differences to let anyone new know that they may bump into either method or any number of variations between the two. And if it doesn't match with your personal way of doing things, it can be a bit off-putting. So if it doesn't feel right, keep looking. When we come to the, in inverted commas, organic method, this, as far as the certification is concerned, describes a system of production in which things are excluded. Herbicides, pesticides, fungicides and fertilisers of a synthetic nature are all banned. When we see a certified organic label on a product, we can be reassured these additives have not been used. However, there is no guarantee that the soil has been treated in a carbon-sensitive manner. As I've stated elsewhere in this feed, and I won't go back and list all the episodes I've done it in, I've observed a registered organic enterprise up close and personal. Now, they sang and continue to sing the praises of their system to the world, whilst ploughing long garden beds, 100 metres plus, that would be over 300 foot in the old money, ploughing them 3 times over a fortnight before planting anything. The soil was bare to the atmosphere, it got rained on, it got pulverised, it was just very unpleasant to watch. And this, I think, is exactly the sort of thing we need to avoid. I would think carefully before going the certified organic path without a carbon-sensitive approach to the soil. Now, this enterprise was basically a chemical farm without the chemicals and the liberal use of compost ploughed into beds, so the machinery was everywhere. Now, this is not surprising, given that it's been around for 50, 60, 70 years, and it was the only non-chemical system popularly known when this particular place was set up. It was also the system offered by John Seymour in the Complete Book of Self-Sufficiency, and that was first published back in 1976, people, not 18. 2 years earlier, in 1974, John Jeevons had released How to Grow More Vegetables Than You Ever Thought Possible on Less Land Than You Can Imagine, and again with the double dig approach. And he's doubled down on that over time, no pun intended. In 1978, permaculture became a word and an alternative to the double dig systems of Seymour and Jeevons. And in 1975, Fukuoka published both The One Straw Revolution and Natural Farming. September 75 for The One Straw Revolution and December that year for Natural Farming. And it is difficult to understand now how slowly new books moved around the globe in the 70s and 80s. Hey, we even answered telephones with no way of knowing who was ringing. So basically those in the West were stuck without the Fukuoka option for a long time. Well, I'm probably thinking it was the mid-80s when I came across it, and it was fairly well established by then. So the choices are clear now. layering, not cultivating, as a rule of thumb, but if you have to cultivate, layer on some mulch and get some plants growing. Now the other great divide is along the omnivore no-meat fisher, and Jeevons falls on the latter side of that divide. The biointensive system relies upon something like 85% of crops being grown just to be used for compost making. Now if this fits with your worldview, then go for it. I, though, have no problem integrating animals into production. Food plants and domesticated stock co-evolved prior to domestication of either. They, particularly in our regenerative and restorative systems, are essential. The action of the stock ensures the continued growth of their feed. Doing so in a way to mimic nature ensures the sustainability of the system. And so enlisting animals into the system means compost, in my view, is available, and also the view of John Seymour for that matter, is available within 24 hours rather than a month or so in the form of animal manures. But animals also requires more of the land steward, a higher level of care than just plants. Then, of course, there's the very large elephant in the room of slaughtering. If you have to use a meatworks, well, then you must. I prefer to do the job myself, not because I enjoy it in any way, shape or form, but because I can do the job quickly and humanely and be sure of how it's done. I don't look forward to the job, and at present I'm preparing myself to knock a couple of spare roosters on the head. Not literally, but they will be killed and I and mine will be eating the flesh. Now, if you can't face this, and no abattoir is going to take 2 roosters to do the job for me, or for you, or for anyone else for that matter, you will need to find another solution, such as just keeping hens or wethers or steers. Now, this can be a good solution for some, and I'm not going to knock it. As I mentioned in the last 2 episodes, that would be 281 and 282, the future, and the future part 2, now is a time of great flux in world affairs. And I think the best safety net any of us can have is to have a food garden growing. I hope the above has helped you choose which line you'd like to go down, and you don't have to follow one system or the other forever. You can swap and learn things and try things. It's all about experimentation. And so if you need, you know the drill. If you need help, there's the free ebook over at World Organic News, and the No-Dig Gardening course is there too. Links in the show notes. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Thank you all for listening. I'll be back next week.